Welcome back to the Tonic Accord. I'm going to make a bold statement. Libertarians don't exist, or at least they have not existed in American government for the last 100 years. Why am I saying this? Well, we're going to be talking about national debt as well as large government spending in general, and how really the fantasy of a small government in office is a fantasy. So, Alex, we're going to talk today about the national debt for a little bit of perspective. You know, we are now sitting at, what, 29 trillion? An unfathomable kind of number for a layman like myself. And this has increased a lot due to the pandemic, but was already on a steady slope of a rise through the last 3 administrations. Well, actually 4 now, but Trump, Obama, and Bush has been steadily increasing through that time. So what do we do about it? Is there really a small government wing of can we really elect small government officials to reduce this deficit and reduce our debt? Or are we stuck with $29 trillion of debt? Let's dive into it, Alex. What are your thoughts, man? I mean, as someone who is a little bit more fiscally conservative than myself, probably, what do you make of a debt like this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would kind of classify myself somewhat as a libertarian, though that's kind of changed. Like, I personally do view the importance of the federal government or the state in helping people and providing safety nets, that type of jazz, man. But to be honest, I don't know if there's any way we could even go even close to back from this. Like you said, we're almost close to $30 trillion in debt, which I mean, there's Americans that are at $10,000, $20,000 in debt. That's a lot. So just imagine 30 trillion. And yeah, I don't see us ever going back from that. So kind of the blanket statement of my view on this whole thing is, if we're not going to be able to cut spending, we should spend smarter. Because right now, I think part of the appeal of Trump, especially, was that the government is spending all this money, but a lot of people really aren't seeing the benefits of these programs. So I would say that we should maybe focus on streamlining some of these programs, streamlining spending, maybe focusing it on what actually helps American people. And I think that's why we're seeing an appeal of populism kind of on both sides, is people are kind of like, all right, well, if we're going to spend all this, why does the military have over 50% of our national, annual budget and stuff like that? And so I would just say, okay, we're spending a bunch of money these days. Let's focus it. Let's spend it better.
Well, I can agree with that. I definitely think if you're going to spend billions or if not trillions of dollars, you need to make sure that it's not bloat. You need to make sure that it's not getting wasted. And it's because, again, the idea is this is not the government's money. It's the people's money. It's taxpayers' money. And it should go back to them in like you said, in efficient programs. I'm all for that. So let's talk about why has it even gotten sparked this hot? So obviously the most recent reason that we've seen a massive jump is these stimulus packages and massive government spending to keep our economy from falling out of the floor during the COVID pandemic, right? But that's a singular kind of, and we should talk about that more in a bit, but that is kind of a singular thing that, let's leave that aside for a second and talk about even before that, this massive rise over time. One, I think there's a couple aspects. One is military. The military operations, our wars in, the biggest spike before where we are now of our debt to GDP was World War II, right? Wars are expensive. You have to pay for a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of equipment, and you don't even know when it ends, right? You keep going until you think you're done. I guess like Vietnam. And so with us today, the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan has also been a massive contributor to the debt. I think that another one is mandatory spending, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Non-discretionary, which means spending on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. And I think I have somewhere here, I have a stat that shows that the mandatory spending, which is like I said, Medicare and Social Security has increased to 61% of our spending, whereas investment, which is things like education, research, and infrastructure, has decreased in the last 5 decades, down from 30% to 13%. So we're also shifting our focus of what we're spending on in our government, and much more of that is going to Social Security and Medicaid. Why is that? Well, because one is, as time goes on, people want more aid from the government, and then on top of that is people are getting older. The entire baby boomer generation is now hitting that age where they're applying for these government programs and retiring and cashing in on their Social Security, and that's ballooning our debt.
Yeah, definitely. So,
I was gonna say, do you see any other sources of debt, or like any patterns of spending from administration to administration?
Yeah, I'd like to put Trump in the queue for a moment, just because, like you kind of mentioned with COVID, I think there's, strangely enough, so Brookings had a thing where the top 3 biggest drives of spending, or biggest rises in spending, I guess we could say, it's Bush number 1, Lincoln number 2, and Trump number 3. The first 2 make sense: war, conflict, giant military spending. Trump, on the other hand, was one of the only presidents in recent memory who was not involved in a war, but still our spending went up. And I think you hit it right between the eyes. Is we have the basically entitlement programs. There's more people that are needing them, and then let's also couple that with Trump's 2017 tax cuts and the pandemic, and I think it creates the perfect storm for just completely exasperating our deficit. But again, I think for the moment, let's wait on Trump, just because there's a lot of factors aside from that. But I think you're absolutely correct, especially when it comes to Bush, because here's an interesting number that was out of Brookings too, was that Bush added 6.1 trillion to our deficit, but it was 101% increase, which was actually close to kind of after the Great Depression going into World War II, which it was 106% increase of GDP at the time. And so the problem here is that under Bush, we saw 101% increase in our debt.
Yeah.
and I think since then it's kind of just been snowballing off a cliff, basically, because Obama also, actually, in terms of numbers, the debt grew 8.6 trillion under him, which is higher than Bush, but less as a percentage of our GDP. And so I think we're seeing a trend, to me, which just shows that we have all these kind of clandestine efforts. We have all these never-ending wars, or whatever Trump calls them. And I think the combination of all this has kind of put us where we're just throwing money into an endless fire of a military complex that is clearly not really bringing us an outcome that's working. And let's remember that Clinton, when did he leave office? 2001, I guess. Prior to Clinton leaving office, he was one of the only presidents in recent memory that's actually helped balance the budget.
Yeah.
And so there's a clear trend, to me, is that as soon as Bush got in there, 9/11 happens, that just starts shooting up. And then Obama was caught in these endless wars. He didn't really do much to help. He also had a recession, which is important to remember. And Trump kind of just exasperated it by kind of careless policies, and then we had the pandemic be an icing on the cake. So that's kind of my wrap up, in my opinion, of what's happened in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, and let's talk about Trump a little bit, because you hit the nail on the head with Bush and Obama, but Trump campaigned on reducing the debt and fiscal responsibility, and being so good at deals and able to manipulate tariffs that he would reduce our deficits, reduce our national debt. And the opposite happened even before the pandemic. And I think we have, where was that one? From ProPublica. ProPublica talked about how the revenue that increased from tariffs, because the idea was, well, we're going to reduce taxes. We're going to reduce taxes. That will stimulate the economy, and overall, the revenue from that, including from some tariffs to protect American businesses, that will make up the difference and help us balance our budget. That was the idea. And it didn't turn out like that. And ProPublica here has a great article about, digging into what happened with our national debt under Trump, even before the pandemic. And how, look, it says here that tariffs did bring in additional revenue. In fiscal 2019, they netted about $71 billion, up from $36 billion under Barack Obama's last year. But although that's a lot of money, that's less than 1/750th of the national debt. So the idea that this could somehow fill the hole that these tax cuts were creating is false. It didn't pan out that way. And I think that's there's the two sides of our national debt. One is, I think you're right that we could probably curb and be more efficient with our spending. I think that's almost always true. And I always encourage our government to, reanalyze, make sure that there's like committees to reanalyze our policies and the way we're spending our money, especially with the defense budget and Social Security. That has to be a part of it. But the other part of it is the revenue side. It's to me, it was unwise to cut corporate taxes by 14%. While we were already at such a low unemployment, right? The good times. Before the pandemic, Trump pretty much talked about it all the time, which was how good the economy was doing. And it was doing good. And I think that in those times is when you save for the future. And instead, as we cut our revenue, kind of expecting the good times to keep on rolling. And that's not what happened. Now, of course, again, we could have done a lot more to prevent what happened with COVID, but we couldn't have predicted the COVID crash. But still, you could at least assume that there will be some kind of crash eventually, and you need to have, the ability to ride out the storm. And I don't think the Trump tax cuts allowed that for us. I think the tax cuts combined with the increased spending with the COVID pandemic is the opposite of the balance sheet we should be achieving.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's the perfect storm, which is interesting again because Trump's a Republican. Well, he ran as a Republican. I would disagree that he's a Republican, but anyways. And second, basically, he didn't do it through a giant military, quagmire. He did it because of kind of this optimistic carelessness. It's clear, like the donor class in the Republican Party wanted it. That's who he was supporting, even though he was going to drain the swamp. And corporate tax cuts, these middle class tax cuts that expire quite soon, all leads to exactly this quagmire. And then let's mix in a trade war that, it helped us a little bit, but it also didn't pan out as much as we were hoping for. And then flash forward to 2020, a once in a life or once in a century pandemic is going to do that. And that's the sort of fascinating thing to me, more on kind of the political philosophy side of it, is that to me it seems like the Republican Party has kind of a market control over kind of working class voters right now, but they really haven't had a platform ever to deal with it. They have the appeal to working class voters. I mean, Trump obviously did quite well with a lot of working class voters,
sure, yeah.
But the policies don't reflect that. And to me, it shows that the GOP and the the Democratic Party have pretty similar, at least, goals on spending. But how they spend it shows me that the GOP is really corporatist in so many ways that, and if you just look at this, because even Bush and Obama, a lot of the reasons why this happened was external forces like a recession or 9/11, and the fact that Trump kind of did this based on the policies of like Gary Cohn, Goldman Sachs guy. Like these are the people that would want this. They're not the ones that would actually want to help average Americans. And it's fascinating to me because still so many working class Americans support the GOP and they support Trump, and clearly the policies don't mirror that. So again, like I am a capitalist. I think capitalism's the best system out there that we have. But at the same time, I think we need to look at countries like Norway, like most of the Scandinavian countries, even China in some aspects, where they spend a bunch, but they get a lot in return. Like, obviously, I'm not saying let's lock up Uyghurs, let's do all the crazy stuff. But if China wants something done, they'll spend a shit ton of money and get it done in weeks. Yeah. Where for us, we spend a shit ton of money, and it takes 10 years to even enact some of the thing we spend it on, And I think it's just a broken system. So that's why I think a lot of more libertarians are like, well, what the hell? Like, we're getting the worst of everything. We're spending a lot, and we're not getting anything in return. And I think Trump kind of showed that. And then in the last year, we got one stimulus check back in April, and it took almost a year to get the second round of that. And that's not effective government. That's broken government. And we're still spending like it should be effective.
Yeah. I just don't think that there really is anyone calling for small government, really. Like Rand Paul may talk about it, but, we're building walls, we're expanding our military, I just see it as like no one's small government, and which is funny because the whole reason we decided to do this episode is because I saw a comment from someone who used to work in the Clinton administration on a political forum, and he was talking about how in the 1990s there was this big battle about deficit spending and like welfare basically. and this guy had wanted Clinton. He wanted Clinton to expand the welfare programs under his administration, but Clinton decided not to. He thought that it would be too detrimental to get reelected, and so he played kind of the middle. And so he went in front of Congress and said that the era of big government is over. A pretty bold statement, especially for a Democrat. I mean, saying like the age of big government is over in the 90s as a Democrat is a fascinating thing to think about, because I don't think anyone would even say that today. And even if someone would, the claim would be false. And I think Clinton's claim was false. So yeah, he balanced a budget for, one term, but then boom, 2001, 9/11, Iraq War, and we're off to the races again with our spending, and it hasn't slowed down since. So it's just a really interesting thing to think about. Like, I think Clinton was wrong. I think the era of big government was ramping up.
Yeah, definitely. And, I can't help but wonder if it was his experience running the government and sitting in the White House that maybe caused him to say this. Because I always think about how we kind of saw Republican obstructionism grow during that time. Like, that was the rise of the Newt Gingrich part of the party. The kind of segue into Trumpism, the Rush Limbaugh being the kind of microphone for this new populist right. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if Clinton somewhat meant that the obstructionism on the right that he was starting to face towards the end of his time in office was going to just keep growing, so big government would never be able to do anything because of the obstructionism. But instead, we've had just kind of Republicans obstruct when they're out of office and then spend like Democrats when they're in office, which is kind of funny. But it is interesting to hear Clinton say that, because I don't think anyone would think he was a small government advocate. No. So it just makes me wonder if maybe what happened when he was in there made him think that this kind of, maybe he saw the Tea Party-esque movement coming that in theory says they're against big government until they're in office. Because I would argue Trump was just a later iteration of the Tea Party movement.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, certainly economic, like, as far as, like, the actual debt itself, Democrats would probably want to spend a bunch of money domestically, and Republicans, in general, this is a very big generalization, are fine with large spending if it's defense, right? Sorry, there's someone honking. I don't know why.
Uh-oh. I want you.
So, Republicans are okay with a large spending if it's defense and maybe border security. Democrats are okay with a large spending if it's like, welfare systems, social safety nets, that. I also want to talk a little bit about like cultural understandings of large government, because, the famous thing is like the libertarian who says is like, I want a gay couple to be able to defend their weed plants with guns. That's kind of like the t-shirt you see about like, a lot of social freedom. And I think that it's important to remember that, because obviously no Democrat would say that they're like, not no Democrat, but it's rare for a Democrat to say they're small government, but they generally want social freedoms. Whereas Republicans, interestingly enough, economically want a small government, but often, especially like very culturally conservative people, they want a big government if it involves, protecting religious rights and for perhaps even, demanding or like allowing, like banning abortion. Banning abortion is a pretty religiously tied policy position, and that requires a large government to enforce. So like my point is only that, because you are on the culturally conservative, if you're like a cultural conservative and a conservative Republican, there are things that you might think are egregious that like would call for a large government. I don't think Republicans are small government anymore, and I think that like things like shutting down Planned Parenthood and banning abortion and like look at the kids in cages thing, man. Like look at the immigration with the kids in cages, and by the way, I'm also upset with Biden's use of these facilities as well. So no one's off the hook here. But that to me is extremely big government. That's a large state deciding to like separate a family from a child and put them in a cage. That is Orwellian if I've ever heard it. And that's supported by Republicans. I mean, that's big government for you. That's big government. So, my point here is that like if you're out here saying like you're some small government Republican, I call BS.
You know, what I would say is just, and I agree with you, and it's always kind of blown my mind is how on one breath Republicans say they're small government, and then on the next breath they're trying to obstruct your kind of sexual freedoms or whatever else it may be. And to me, what I've kind of gathered is that, you know, I think people more on the left believe that the government is supposed to be designed basically to give people a safety net and to help their rights be equally protected. And so I think if you put on your Republican hat for a minute, maybe even your MAGA hat, then I think a lot of Republicans, especially more the evangelical Republicans, believe that this country was developed on Christian values. And I don't believe that, but I do think that that is where they're at. So for them, like where the left values safety nets and protecting everyone's freedom, I think a lot of people on more the evangelical right especially believe that it is the goal of the government to protect a Christian majority in the country. And that is not correct in my opinion, but I think that's where they lean, is that their view of what the US government should do kind of comes from this protecting religious freedom, but also meaning protect a predominantly Christian nation. And so I think that's where we get this almost like schism in big or small government, because I think that that's why you have states like Alabama, or I forget where it was, where that lady wouldn't make the cake for the gay couple. Was that in
somewhere in the
Missouri?
South? I remember the lady. I can see her face, but yeah, it was like somewhere down there.
Yeah, like I think that's why they're for states' rights, is because they want to just say basically like, you know what, even if the federal government does this, like we just don't believe in a big apparatus to do it. And it's funny because they fight against sometimes like national spending and then say the system doesn't work. But it's become kind of a chicken or the egg argument. But I think that if you don't have a federal apparatus to deal with stuff like abortion rights, then it makes it easier for them to keep allowing, you know, clinics to make up these decisions that are controversial and maybe not constitutional. And like, because I don't really see, now under Trump, I think it became more apparent, but I don't particularly see the Supreme Court until Trump really politicized it. I mean, it has been, but it got worse under Trump. I haven't really seen a lot of Republicans actually wanting to completely get rid of Roe v. Wade. I think for them, they want to just open it up to the states, which is kind of a quasi way of saying get rid of Roe v. Wade. But I think that's always been their take, is let's find a way around big government, and in the means of that, we're going to take away decisions. Like, if that makes sense. That was kind of ranting here at this point about that, but I think they want to muddle the waters of federal government so that it's easier to let people with religious views enforce what they believe on.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting point, because we talk about smaller or large government. That's a good distinction. You might want a small federal government, but a strong and more involved in your lifestyle state government, right? Mm-hmm. That's a good point. You know, people might want their individual state to decide things for them and not have the federal government have a say. That's a different kind of large government, right? It's still a form of it. Right. But that's a good point. I just think it's now I'm not like, I personally think large government is fine if used well, and I think that large governments are actually a necessary foundation on which strong economies can grow. I think that one of the reasons America's economy is so successful compared to the world, on top of many other things, but one of it is a strong federal government. If you look at the economic impact post-World War II, FDR policies, strong government investing in infrastructure and investing in its country, it shot us to the moon, or at least overall GDP. Again, not everyone saw that success, but it shot America to the moon for the next few decades. So I'm fine with large government as long as it's used well and efficiently and correctly and without reducing anyone's human rights. But I do think that it's a shame that there is no real, legitimate, and like consistent small government movement to kind of keep the two sides in check. I mean, I guess you could say it is libertarianism, but the reality is, I'm sorry out there, libertarians, the Libertarian Party is kind of a joke. I mean, you put up Gary Johnson 9 out of 10 times, you're going to get laughed at. So there's no real actual people in government, I think, to like keep in check some of these spending. It's just kind of two sides that want to spend it differently, and I think that is a shame.
Yeah, like I think a lot like communism and anarchism, libertarianism, the proof is in the pudding. The devil's in the details. Like I think libertarianism is a better guidance or a good messenger to show people about personal responsibility. I think it's better in theory than practicality. A lot like communism, the idea of sharing things to, lift up the little guy. But, when it's actually carried out or rolled out into a country, it doesn't work. Now, we haven't really seen libertarianism on a practical scale carried out inside of the world because I agree with you. I don't think it actually works. Again, I think for me, it's more of a guiding principle of how people should act on an individual basis inside of an economy or inside of a country. But I'm with you, and I think clearly the trends are going in the opposite direction. Now, okay, so the one thing I wanted to ask you though, really quick, it's kind of adjacent to this, that it involves the stimulus bill, which is obviously a huge, huge.
1.9 trill, man, 1.9 trill.
Okay, so what is this phenomenon? We have Republicans. Not a single Republican voted in favor of it, but then we have Republicans now basically kind of trying to take credit for it passing. There was a gentleman in Alabama, I think it was Ted Cruz in Texas, who were what's her name, Lauren Boebert in Colorado. She was saying that she was glad this bill passed and that the money was the American people's from the beginning, but they all voted no. So isn't this kind of strange, where you're seeing an obstructionist party, but they're trying to almost take the credit for the popularity of getting paychecks to people that need it?
I mean, I'm personally not surprised. I think that it was a poor move, considering if you look at how popular these direct payments were, and the 1.9 trillion stimulus bill in general. You had polls showed almost consistently high 50s, 60s, and then sometimes even 70% approval of this bill across the board. And so I think it was politically stupid for these people to vote no on it. But, the argument I heard was I wanted to vote yes for the direct payments, but there was other things in the bill that I did not like. And that's a valid argument, but then you should have just voted. But then don't take credit. Like, vote yes if you want to take credit, and vote no if you don't. And I think that is a valid argument. If you're like, oh, I don't like these other things, then vote no and then own it. don't go back and be like, hey, I helped with the direct payments, because you didn't. You voted no. So it is a weird, it's hypocritical. It's it's what is it, like smoke bombing, or throwing sand in the eyes, right? Like trying to distract from the fact that you actually wanted to kill this bill, and then you're saying, oh, we gave Americans help. But Bernie Sanders had mentioned that the political reality is people only really care when they get that stimulus check in their bank account. They're unfortunately only maybe the politically inclined will be there to actually count who voted for what and take a really consensus of who actually did support this. I think a majority of Americans are just going to get that check, say thanks Biden, not realizing it was voted through Congress, and just move on with their day. I would think it's politically stupid, but I've been surprised so many times in the last few years by the American public that perhaps these Republicans will just be able to do it, and they can look back and say, hey, I helped you out, even though they voted no.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that, because I think you're right, and Adam Kinzinger, who's one of the Republican congressmen that I really do still like, he was more honest about it. He's like, I didn't find unity in this bill, so I voted against it. At least he was honest. But also I think there's a kind of a sickness inside of the Republican Party that involves the view that government doesn't do anything and that they don't have a role in government, because Ted Cruz, goes to Cancun, and his basically key argument was that I'm a I'm a senator. This is a Texas issue. He's like, there's nothing I can do about this. And I kind of see the same thing from the Lauren Boeberts, who said, I voted against it. What am I supposed to do? But this was good for people. It's like there's this view of kind of nihilism inside of the GOP that's like, they'll get it done. We'll try to obstruct it, and we don't really believe we have a role in government, so we'll just jet off to Cancun or vote no. But then when it gets fixed, we'll kind of go along with it, And I think that's that small government kind of problem.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it just goes to show how BS this whole conversation about unity is. I think that even that comment of I don't see unity in the bill. Dude, tell that to the people struggling. Tell that to the guy that like really freaking needs this check, or the women that you see it on the news. You see these stories of people that are like, when this $1,400 hits, I will then be able to buy my groceries, and I'll finally be able to take maybe a month where I can just breathe, right? And imagine being in that situation, and then this senator who makes 6 figures a year at least, because obviously they have other forms of income, is telling you, well, I don't see unity in the bill. Like, what the hell does that mean? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything practical. And it goes to show that, look at the votes. No GOPs voted for it at all. There's obviously no semblance of crossing the aisle. The Democrats, you could argue, didn't do much crossing the aisle either, but they did do some concessions, and those concessions were to get moderate Democrats. They were to get Joe Manchin on board. But the fact that like the minimum wage fight, completely gone out of the bill, and no Republican voted for it, like no compromise whatsoever, like unity, it's a dance. It takes 2 to tango, and I don't see Republicans wanting to dance at all. So don't give me this crap about, oh, I didn't see unity in the bill. Like, dude, screw you, man. That's such a that's such an abstract cop-out of a response to a seriously needed stimulus package. Now, if you want to go dive in deep and think about like specific, you want to look at specific things and be like, hey, I think this might be detrimental to the economy, or hey, this might, not be the best way to use this money. That's fair. I'm all for criticizing a very big bill that should be criticized at certain points. But the idea of I don't see unity is just so dumb to me. That's such a cop-out.
Well, Drew, and you're wrong. There is unity in the bill. 70% of Americans were in favor of it.
Exactly. If you have and that's a rare amount of public support for a bill this big, and you're telling me that there was no crossing the aisle. I mean, it is a massive testament to how entrenched our parties are and how BS this conversation of unity really is.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And to me, it just shows that we just have a problem with Republican obstructionism. Like, I always have wondered if it's like a chicken or the egg argument. Is our federal government bogged down because it's bogged down, so then Republicans hate it? Or is it because they keep like not supporting federal funding and keep talking about how bad the government is, so eventually it actually becomes bogged down? Like, I think we have a problem of obstructionism on the right, and it kind of brings me back to kind of like pre-Civil War, where the rise of the Republican Party happened. You had the Know Nothing Party, you had all these other parties that were kind of just obstructionist, and it gave root to a new party. And I do wonder, good or bad, if something does come out of this, because the Republican Party didn't, to me, it's unconstitutional and just anti-democratic, excuse me, that I think it was like 35 to 40% of Republicans, depending on the poll you look at, supported this stimulus check, or at least the majority of it, yet not a single Republican voted for it. That's not representing your base. That's not representing your voters. That's by definition anti-democratic. And it's that, like, who's not for unity are the Republicans in the Senate and the Congress right now. Not Democrats. It's not Biden's fault. And it's going to be interesting, man. But I think the government is just going to keep getting bigger, and we're going to keep seeing opposition to it. And I'm kind of, my last takeaway, which I wanted to say earlier and I totally forgot, was that if we want to have efficient government, fine, efficient big government, what we need is two parties that are healthy, that are willing to work together and make it happen. Or a one-party state like China, which is much easier, but obviously we don't want to go that way. So, but the problem is they're so forced on these half-assed milquetoast compromises. That's why, to pass solar panels in California, it takes a decade to actually enact some of these policies, because you have to appease every other interest group, every Republican, every Dem. It just gets convoluted. So that's why it ends up we have these pork-like bills that actually don't help the people that need them.
Yeah, we have kicked the can down the road for the last 80 years, and that can is getting huge. And while governments can operate on debt, and economists talk about all the time that governments can certainly and do successfully operate with the debt, you don't want it to grow that big and that fast. So we certainly need to really analyze how large our government is, where we're spending, and where we're getting revenue from. That's kind of the first conversation we had. And then the second one is just a little thing about the unity, because I do want to talk about how Democrats weren't calling for unity during the Trump era either. They were trying to, obviously impeach him twice and try to obstruct him just as much. But there was no conversation about unity. Republicans never called for it. Republicans were like, we're in charge, screw you, we're going to do what we want. So, like, there was no olive, like, for Trump era, no one extended an olive branch on either side. For Biden seems like he's trying to extend an olive branch and Republicans are swatting it away. That's the difference I see. I'll admit that Democrats were not about unity during the Trump period either, but I don't think no one asked them to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, like, I just think that we need to stop just trying to obstruct the other party.
Yeah.
That it's never going to get good outcomes. You need two healthy parties that are willing to kind of accept they're wrong on one thing and not on the other. And that's probably not going to happen for a long time. Yeah. But I just see right now this state of affairs. I mean, Obama gets elected, the rise of the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party, they obstruct him. He can't get anything done without executive action. And Trump gets in, overturns all Obama's stuff, and the Democrats do the same. It's just this endless cycle. Yeah. And like just replace D with R, and it's the same thing. And it needs to stop because, Denmark, Sweden, some of these countries, I know they're small, but the idea still is the same, is that they're hyper-capitalist. But they spend a shit ton on things that help people. And also they have the happiest people in the world. Denmark's #1 for happiness. So obviously they're doing something right. Yeah. And it's effective, big government that also allows the free market to shine.
Oh, there you go. Well, that should wrap up this episode, talking about, is there a small government movement really in our government at all? And the massive amounts of debt. So let us know your thoughts on this debt. Is this an issue, or can we keep operating like this, like we have for decades, and just kind of keep an eye on it? Let us know your thoughts. We definitely want to hear. We're about to wrap this episode up, and then we're going to be talking about what's next. What are we going to talk about next, Alex?
Well, we're going to be talking about statehood, which I'm pretty excited about. That's mainly D.C. and Puerto Rico, maybe a little Guam in there, but it's a hot button issue, and I think now that Democrats are in quiet control, it might get kind of moved forward. We'll see.
So stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching the Tonic Accord.